So, Itai, thanks a lot for joining us. So, we'll just get right to it. One of the major questions that comes up again and again, that what exactly is the difference between a technology office and a product office?
And what do you mean in that? I mean, when you say office, that's
I
for
would
me.
really say so. Quite a few startups would have, or maybe some established startups would have a tech side, a CTO, and a CPO leading.
Mm-hmm.
So, how would
Okay.
you sort of like differentiate between those two?
I think the CTO is in general responsible for the direct management of developers. So he's responsible for them. And he is responsible for the vision of the tech stack. And what that actually means, it means how to execute on the product strategy in a way that will allow the company to achieve its goals in the longer term. That's what the CTO would do. From my perspective, the CPO would have to create the picture of where the company wants to go from a product perspective, which means it has to be very strongly incorporated with business strategy. I think CTOs, they need to understand the business strategy for sure, but they don't necessarily have to interact with it so much. I think the CPO has to interact with the business much closer from one hand, and he has to be able to translate business requirements into, tangible requirements and a vision which has a customer side to it. So that's one thing. The customer can be an end user that uses your software or your service, can be a B2B, can be your partner, can be anything, basically. But you have to have a vision. Where would you like to go? I think it's also the CPO's responsibility to define, together with the other management members, but to lead the definition of KPIs that the business has to be looking at. So in some cases, it will also relate to sales or to business development. But I think in the end, if this is a product-driven company, it all in the end trickles down to product. So for me, the product is much more in the center of the company from a communication perspective, while tech is implementing things that come through product. So they need to do it in the right way. They need to choose the right technology. They need to have the right architecture. They need to write good, scalable, clean code. But unless you're doing a startup which is tech-based as a product, that's it. That's at least my perception.
Okay, that's amazing. That's a very good response. So, so now coming towards a question, let's somebody has just sort of like came up with the idea. The group has sort of like started working together. So, do you think that this product management at that point is relevant for them at that particular point, or this is something which can sort of like come later on?
I think that's an excellent question, which I keep running into throughout my career as a product person. You always see that there is a tipping point within a company between the point where the founders think they can do everything by themselves and the point when they realize they don't. Normally, at this point, they realize that they need someone to take over the product. I think in the early stages, it's okay to have, if you have a person that has the vision from a business perspective and a person who can execute on the technical side, you probably don't need someone who's doing purely product. I think the product and the vision at this point are pretty much the same thing. It's just the ability to break down the vision into tangible, deliverables on a very short term, on short iterations. And if you're able to do this as a founder, you probably don't have to start looking for someone who will do product for you. But I think it's very important to be aware that if you want to establish a successful company, you need to be thinking and monitoring very closely at which point should you bring this product person and what do you expect from them? Because if you just want to have this person write tickets for you, and just interact with other parts of the company or the customer and bring in some input and put this into tickets that the developers can work on, that may work in the short term. And for very unique companies, it may work even in the medium and long term. But generally speaking, I think you need to understand that it's about establishing processes. So I think product's job in an organization, and the earlier you start with someone who has this understanding, the better off you will end, is to define how do you make decisions.
Okay.
What are the criteria that drive the company towards success? Like I said, you have to define what are the KPIs in the beginning, and you have to constantly reiterate and recheck them. But how do you make decisions, and you make sure that these decisions actually support the KPIs you defined? For me, this is product, right? And if you are able to do this and define these processes of how do you decide, do I do A or I do B? Now, I don't know. Who makes this decision? How do I make this decision? If you're able to put a structure in place or a process in place that allows you to do this in a consistent way, you are probably going to do much better than if you don't.
Okay.
And this requires a person who can do product, but not on a junior level, but at least on a level that has some experience with understanding these questions.
Okay, so I think that's a very good point that you mentioned, that you're sort of like looking for an experienced person. So define that ideal product guy. Is it like a techie or a business guy, or is it a mix of both? And there is also a term that is coming up again and again, the technical product management, where there's a lot of emphasis on the technical side of it. So define what's an ideal guy, product guy.
There is no ideal guy. I think there is a match between a personality and skills and qualifications and a situation and a company. A person who will be successful in company A that does product whatever, in a certain part of the life cycle of the company may not be successful at the same time doing something completely different in another company. So I think the point here is to realize what you're looking for. As a hiring manager, I think the first step to do a successful recruitment for product is to know what you want and to really understand, am I looking for someone who can now look at the code of the developers and tell them that they need to build a new microservice for this and not use the old one? That's a very different requirement from a PM than if I want someone who can talk to the customer and be very friendly and outgoing and get insights from them, which are very soft skill based, and then translate this into requirements that are user stories. They're non-technical at all. It's a different person, right? Normally, this will not be the same person unless you have someone who is very, very qualified. And this also comes because my perception of product within organizations is very dependent on what the organization needs. For me, product, I always say we are like water or we are like glue. Our job is to occupy the space between different parts of the company and make sure that the information flows peacefully and in the right direction, and that, also everybody is joined together and they all move in the same direction. For me, that's product. But not everybody would agree with this definition. That's based on my, 16 years of experience. That's how I perceive this, and that's what I try to bring with my teams when I build my teams in organizations to try to bring. Because in some cases, you will have development teams who need micromanagement. They need to be told exactly what to do. And that's okay. It may work okay in some cases, but then it requires different things from the product person than if you have engineers who want to define, how to implement things by themselves. They just want to know what needs to be the outcome. And then that requires something completely different and puts the product person in a different position towards the developers. And of course, it gives him more or less time to do different things. Therefore, you have to always have to know what you're looking for, what type of qualifications you need, what type of organization you're running, what type of processes, who will he or she be working with, and what is the expectation. It's very different. I always define people, there are people who are more front-end oriented, so they are less technical. They come more from either business or design. And for them, it's normally easier to work on the soft skill part, to be better on communication, to look at tangible things. And then the other part is the back-end guys, the guys who normally were developers in the past, and now they're transitioning or they have already transitioned. And then for them, normally it's easier to sit down and talk with the developers on how to do things than to look at the customer and directly communicate with them. And of course, then you have the well-rounded candidates sometimes who are the best ones, of course, that they have the understanding, the technical understanding and ability to challenge the developers, but at the same time, they're likable and they can they have a proactive mind towards asking questions to the business or to the customer. And these are the great guys that you want to catch always, but they're not so easy to find. They're quite hard.
So in terms of, so you mentioned the fact that as a leader, you bring in your team. And what does, from your perspective, what does an ideal product team looks like? What kind of functions it should have and kind of roles it should have?
Well, again, I will repeat what I said before. The ideal team will match the structure of the company. And therefore, whenever I join a company, first of all, I have to take a look what's working and what's not working. And in order to fix what's not working, what are the changes that we need to do? And then that will have an impact on the company structure. And it's not just product structure, it's the entire company structure. In most companies that I join, I in the end find myself rebuilding the entire structure of the organization because, like I said, I believe that our job is to facilitate the movement of information, of requirements, of feedback from customer, from commercial, from sales, from whoever, to the tech side, and also vice versa. And therefore, that really depends on the case. But generally speaking, when I look at my normal teams, so you have product managers, their job is to lead teams of developers. It could be called teams, could be called squads, could be called pods, could be tribes, whatever you want, doesn't matter. In the end, their job is to take high-level requirements from the business side and translate them into tangible things that we have a vision how the business will be using. It could be the end user, it could be the partner, it could be an internal tool. They work very closely with designers. Now, in design, you have basically two functions, right? You have a UX design, someone who thinks about the experience that the product is giving. So it's an end-to-end role. It doesn't look at the colors. It doesn't look at the font necessarily. It looks at the entire experience of how we present things. What do we present? And it's a much higher level of design. And then you have graphic designers or UI designers who look at, should I have a big button, round corners, or a rectangle button with a background, green or red or whatever. And this is, so you would have both in the product team together with the PMs. And then there's the side of the research. I think research has developed into product very much in the past few years. It's not that common still in many places, but for me, it became very fundamental. Because if you want to do data-driven product development, which means you don't want to base your decisions on guesses or on feelings, you want to look at facts, you need to do two types of research. One is mostly the quantitative research. So you will maybe run an A/B test on your website or on your service or on your app, doesn't matter, where you will show one variation and another variation, and you will split the traffic and you will see who gets, which one converts better. That's a quantitative test, which is relatively easy to do using different tools, and it's very tangible. It brings you a very clear result. This version, variation converted better, therefore I should now use this one as my base. And now I will continue iterating on this. The other side, which is not that well known, but is equally as important, is the qualitative side. The qualitative side is the proactive research you need to go out and do, which is not only based on what you have, it's based on stuff that you still don't have. How do you know what you don't have? Your numbers, when you put stuff on an A/B test, they will not tell you what you don't have. In some cases, they will give you an indication, but in most cases, you don't know if you're missing something huge, that could be just here. You just don't see it. And if you do qualitative research, which means interviews, surveys, actively talking to users, customers, whatever you want to call them, you may have insights that are impossible to get any other way. And this could have a huge impact. And that's why this is so important. Many companies don't do that. And that's why the struggle, I think, to make these, the big jumps. When you do A/B testings, it's very incremental. You do small improvements. You add another % here, 2% there, great. But the black swans, the things that you don't see, that you don't know, change everything now by 30% overnight. That's only going to happen if you all of a sudden something clicks, and it can only click if you get fed information from the actual users who use whatever you're selling them or giving them, to make it better.
Okay. So one interesting question, you've sort of like mentioned this process. Now let's just suppose as a product head, you're building an AI based product or a deep learning based product. Over there, you can't really sort of like just give them the UX and the UI parts and just feed it into the tech part, and that's not going to happen because a drawing would not do anything for them. So what's the process like over there? I mean, if you have a sort of like an idea as to what should be that, does product make sense in such product development cases, or is there some other way of giving them the right things to work on?
Well, that's a good question. I think in these questions, if you know what you're trying to build, what is the product? For me, that's always the first question, right? What is the product? If you can mock the product, without having it to actually work, you can at least see if it makes sense to users. Now, let's forget about AI, whatever is underneath the hood, right? You first need to see if people, when they go down the street, do they look at this car, or do they completely say, that's ugly, I don't want to touch this? Then whatever you build under the hood is not going to help you, right?
Sure.
So I think that's always a good approach. It's always a good approach to validate the necessity of what you're trying to do. So ask the question, are you trying to solve a problem using AI? What is the problem? Are people actually looking for a solution to this problem? And you can do that using any type of mock. And that will give you at least a good basis to understand if you're barking at the right tree or maybe you're completely off. Because I've also met so many companies that thought that they are solving a problem, but in the end it turns out that no one cares about this problem. It may be a problem, but no, really no one cares. No one needs a solution for this problem. It's not of interest to anyone. And this is the first thing you need to validate, that the solution to this problem is actually meaningful to the people you want to give this solution to. And this you can do by talking to them, by showing them mocks, and getting what they do. This is very similar to what I just mentioned, this qualitative research. So here you do like very early stage research to validate the assumptions that you have.
Yeah. So and once you sort of like go deeper into that particular project, like a deep learning project, so do you sort of like give them sample data? Okay, this is how this data should be labeled or should work, and then they go and build on that, or is it like a different approach to it? Because
well, to be honest, I'm not an expert in either machine learning, deep learning, or AI. From the little experience that I have, the very basic things that I have done in the past, I think here it goes down to define what do you expect the outcome to be. I can't tell the data scientist, for example, how to cluster, which algorithm to use to cluster the data, or how to label the groups. I don't know how to do that. So that's really not my job as a product person. I think my job is to tell him, what do I want to happen? What is the outcome that the business is looking for? So we can measure failure versus success. That's the most I can do, being a non-technical guy. But I think these products, that's why they are, to me as a non-technical guy, they always seem a bit, let's call it obscure. So they're not tangible. I come from the front end that I mentioned before. I'm a business guy, right? So for me, if I can grasp what the product is doing, I can explain it very simply, even if it's a very complex product. And I see that as part of my job, to understand the complexity, but to be able to translate it into very simple terms. But if I cannot grasp how the product is working, then I'm not the right guy, and we will have a problem for sure. So that also depends on the level of depth that you expect, because in cases like this, maybe you need someone to do the product who is actually a data scientist, at least for the technical part. But to define what you want the product to do, that data scientists, they can't do that. They don't do that traditionally, unless they own the product. But normally they will be able to execute on that, but you need to tell them what you want them to do.
So it seems like it's like a more of a nascent industry at this point right now, and they're just trying to figure out what would be the right mechanism for product management for AI projects. I think in most of the business, you would have this tech, sales, and business, and product, and all of those departments, and usually conflicts arise. especially in the case where there's a lot of like different countries involved and different localizations are required. So what happens there? I mean, what's the best way of resolving those conflicts, and maybe who should win? Who's the last one you should listen to?
Well, if you did what I said before when you built your company and you did establish the processes I mentioned, this should be relatively easy. But like I said, there has to be very clear criteria to how do you measure what success is and how do you define what you want to do. And if you have these criteria in place, you can judge any feature request or project request or whatever it is you want to name it. You can judge it relatively easily and compare it relatively easily to other things. Of course, this is based on assumptions in most cases, at least partly, but that's fine. If the same people are making the assumptions, it's relatively easy. And I'm a great believer in trying to simplify things. And I would always look at, what do I expect the business impact of this specific thing to be versus what do I expect the complexity of building this thing to be. And this is called like a pick chart. You put stuff on a pick chart. And normally it's very easy to see what are the things that you definitely need to build first, what are the things that you may consider later, and what are the things that you should never touch. Okay. That's one methodology. There are many methodologies besides pick charts. There are like constraint driven product decisions, or it doesn't matter because the methodologies in the end are just tools to help you structure the process. And therefore, you can choose any one you want as long as you feel comfortable with it and the organization understands it and use it. And if you use it consistently, I think you'll be fine.
So in terms of, let's just talk a bit about those two tools. I think there's a lot of discussion, a lot of hype around design thinking and all of those newer concepts that are coming up.
Yeah.
So what are your opinions? I mean, is it the right way of going about it? Like you pick design thinking and just make it your way, and this is the only way of doing it, or are there other ways of going about doing the job?
I think that really depends on what you're doing. I think, for example, now in my current company, we've been doing design thinking workshops, for example, or design thinking driven product development, but for very specific parts. Okay. So it was mostly looking at our funnel, so the customer journey in the funnel. This was we did from a design thinking perspective. We did a lot of research in advance. We collected a lot of business input, and then we would try to structure this using design thinking. But at the same time, we could always validate what we came out with from design thinking using the mocks that we built, and we would test them. Everything had to be tested and proven by actual users that our assumptions or whatever we came out with was correct. So this is an iterative process. I think design thinking is a good methodology to use, but I don't think specifically it's any better than anything else. Again, it's mostly about what your team feels comfortable with and what are they able to execute on consistently. To me, it's more about you have to understand that you don't get a knockout in product. It's very difficult to get a knockout. It's always a process of iterations. You have to understand that even when you do design thinking, you come out with a prototype, then you test this one, then you get things that work, but also a lot of things that don't work. And you have to do it again. Then you have to do it again and again and again and again and again till the day that you're done. And done is only either you sell the company or you quit or I don't know what. So it's never ending. And that's where I like design thinking. I think it can bring good results if your people understand it and are able to use it efficiently. If not, maybe choose something simpler. Maybe choose something else. But the most important thing is to be consistent and is to be precise on the definition of, what are your KPIs? What are you looking at? What are you measuring? And reiteration on that all the time.
Okay, that's fair. So in terms of routine, or in terms of how does your day look like? I mean, or maybe for a product manager, what should be a day like?
Ideally, I would say if I expect my product managers to look at the numbers first thing in the morning. So they have KPIs they are responsible and accountable for. They need to look at the numbers every day. That's number one, the basis for everything. Then they have to think what happened in the numbers. Okay? Did something happen? If it happened, can I attribute a reason for that? Did we deploy something yesterday? Did we break something? Did we have downtime? I don't know, whatever. So it's about actually monitoring what's going on with our business. That's number one priority. Number two priority is you need to talk to people. So first and foremost, my PMs are responsible to do their daily scrum, the daily stand-up, whatever you want to call it, with their team or squad. So they have to know what the developers are doing, what QA is doing, what the designer is doing, if they have a designer, whatever it is, the researcher, it doesn't matter, the analyst, whatever they have, they all need to know what everybody's doing and are they on track to achieve the goal that they're currently working on. So normally if you use Scrum, you will have a sprint. In the sprint, you will have a sprint goal. And you need to make sure that the entire team is working on the right things to achieve the sprint goals. And are we on time? Are we on schedule? I think that's the more project management related part in the day. And from there on, you would normally have to focus either on preparing things for the next iterations, preparing things for either A/B testing or research. That again, that depends on what do you want, which questions you need to have answered, and decide how to try to get these answers. And then it's the rest of it is just communication. So it's between design, product, marketing, tech, the business, the customers, everybody. And it's in the end, you also write tickets, of course, right? Okay. So you have to do that. But I believe that, in the end, tickets are just a way to, again, to make sure that requirements are understood by everybody in the same way. So I think there are different ways to write tickets. I think a lot of teams spend a lot of time on trying to define this. I think in the end, every team has to find their own way of doing this. So the most important thing is that they understand each other. And that in the end, the outcome is what you set out to actually get. And if the business gets what they want, I don't care if they write a user story or they write a list of requirements or they write acceptance criteria. Doesn't matter. Whatever works for them. These are like, from my perspective, if they're, proficient enough in their professions, they will find their own mutual ground within the team. I don't think this is something you have to dictate. But that's a day, basically.
Okay. So in terms of managing on this process via tools, there are so many tools for each and everything that you have. For product management, you will have 10 different tools, and for vision, you will have many different tools. And so, which one are your favorites? So obviously, so there are bigger names also. But maybe as a startup founder who's just sort of like getting into this process, what should be their first choices?
To be honest, I don't have any favorites, because for me, these tools in the end, they all do the same thing, give or take. Of course, some have more feature, some have less features. Most companies I have known, they don't use most of these features. It's just a more fancy interface. What you need when you want to set out and do things in a structured way, I think you need to understand that you need to run projects. So if you're running Scrum, for example, you need to have backlogs, you need to have running sprints, you need to have, very important, you need to have a definition of done for the team, so they know when they're done with something, when is it ready. But any ticketing system will do that for you. I mean, everybody now in Berlin, for example, uses probably Jira and Confluence, the Atlassian stack, which is very easy to work. It can be SaaS, it can be hosted, whatever you want. It costs money, but it's very effective. The question is, for me, you can also use free tools. I don't know. I used to use Redmine, which was like the crappiest, ugliest thing, but it did the job just right. I mean, if you don't mind that, it works. The question is, do you know if you need anything on top of that? I think part of the nice part that you have with Jira, for example, is that it allows you to also run the business on a wider scale. So if you're actually going into what is the level beyond epics, so if you collect a lot of user stories into an epic, but then you collect epics, you can start have initiatives. And on top of initiatives, you have portfolios. You actually want to manage your development and the product in a way that actually looks at everything in a quantitative way. It really helps to have these features. If you're a smaller team, you probably don't need that. You can save the money and use any ticketing system for this. I also highly recommend having a project for research, like I mentioned, because research also needs to have a list of hypotheses that you want to research. They need to be ranked, and they need to have a backlog, which is sorted, the same as you would have for product stories. And then you would just have to decide which one I'm going to test based on my resources in a similar way. The other side of that is, of course, documentation. So everybody in Berlin, like I said, uses Confluence now. I think it's easy to use, but any sort of knowledge base can do the same thing, give or take. And there are so many free tools. If you want to save the money in the beginning, you can do that. However, if you can, I suggest starting with good tools is better, because migration is always expensive and annoying, and it's very time consuming. So if you can spare the money in the beginning to start with Jira Confluence, for example, you know that this is something you probably will not move away from, even in 5 years. Okay. So I highly recommend doing that, just because if you get a bigger team and if you get a more tech savvy team, they will want the state of the art tools, and they would complain if you use Redmine because it's ugly. And then at some point you will need to invest in moving everything. And that's not the end of the world, but it's not worth it.
Okay. So somebody who wants to transition into product management, what are some of those tools and resources that are out there they should sort of like go through? Or maybe it's just like they need to learn through the job, or what do you sort of like recommend?
Well, into product management, I think there are a couple of ways. I think one way is to come from development. So knowing how, this thing works from a developer's perspective, you see what product managers do. And then you go and try to do the same. I think that's a valid way. Okay. The other way is to come from the other side, is to come from either marketing or from sales or from even design, which works very closely with product, and see what they do and then try to learn how to do that. There's another way, which is the Scrum way. I see a lot of people coming from, if you want to try to get somewhat relevance in the product today, you will become a Scrum Master or a product owner from a Scrum perspective. These are good ways to get some understanding of how Scrum runs. And since a lot of teams run Scrum, it's effective. But in the end, I think when I look at hiring people, I first and foremost look at their hunger level. Are they motivated? Do they want to learn? Are they open to learn new things? That's number one. Number two is, are they smart? Are they really smart? Can they talk to developers at the same time, talk to accountants, at the same time talk to salespeople or just users in a way that everybody will understand? So I think, it's being smart and being able to, like I said, explain complex topics in relevant ways to the listener. So it can be very simple, it can be very technical, but to be able to do all of this, I think communication is really crucial for PMs. And if you don't have it, if you're not a people's person, then maybe a pure PM role is not for you. You may be able in the end, you can be maybe a technical project manager, fine. But for me, in the end, product people, they need to be very sharp, and they need to be able to translate a lot. And if you're not that type of person, I don't think you would be the right match. And then you can just read. But in the end, I do believe that the same as no one ever taught me how to be a product manager, I just learned by doing it. I didn't even know it was product management when I started.
So what was your process like?
Well, my process is, by education, I'm a lawyer. I have a degree in management as well. But I just decided I don't want to be a lawyer, and I went into an internet company that did value-added services for mobile carriers, and I started as a project manager, part-time, like the lowest entry position you can have. And then I did it quite okay, so they let me do a little bit more. And then I took the business path. I went into business development. I did quite a few years of international business development, which was also, in many cases, a lot of product conceptualization together with the partners. But I didn't do product. And then at some point I realized that I don't care about the travel and the deal signing anymore. I just care about what we deliver in the end. I care about what the user actually uses and how does this solve the user's problem. That's when I realized that I don't want to be like a managing director like I was at the time. I just want to do the product, and I want to leave the business to other people. And since then, I just focused on that, and I took a step back, and I moved much closer to the developers, much closer to the designers, and took on this, just the challenge of how to build the product, and leave the business development to other people.
Okay, so I remember at Lamudi, I guess you used to mention talk a lot about MVP. I think you're a strong proponent of that. If you can sort of like talk more about that.
Sure. I think the great part of being digital and this era in time is that we are able to build things very quickly, and they don't have to be perfect. And this goes back to what I mentioned before. You need validation of your assumptions. MVP is a way to validate that you're doing the right things in the core, right? Okay. So it's a very good way, and I will use another metaphor now. You know, you don't want to be building a ship on shore and then put it in water and realize that it sinks. You don't even know why, but it will sink because you built it on the shore. Yeah. So MVP is not building the ship on the shore. It's inflating a little inner tube, putting it on the water, putting your ass in the middle, getting wet, and then starting to add parts to it. That's MVP for me. That's how I explain MVP to people. So you have to start with something that you see that makes sense to the user, that brings value to the user. And then you can start making it look nice. You can start making it bigger. You can add stuff on top. Some of the stuff will be redundant. Then you have to take it away. Don't leave it there because it's heavy. It will bring the ship down. And you have to keep adding parts. Till in the end, you will have this big ship, hopefully, but this one sails and you know how to drive it. Okay. That's the MVP.
Okay, that's good. So I guess we're coming towards the end. So talk to us about some major tips for managing people, or maybe just let's just try to define it in 3 major tips from Itai for how to manage people.
I think be true to yourself. Okay. So you have to be aware of what you do well and what you don't do well. I think the biggest problem I see in management is that people try to be someone they're not. Okay. If you need to be in control, you're a micromanager, don't pretend you're not, because you will hire the wrong people. They will be frustrated, and in the end, they will kick you in the face. You don't want that. Be true to yourself. Know that if you need to be in control of everything, you need to let people know that this is how it's going to work. They may learn a lot from you because you're smart and you're good, but it's going to be difficult for them maybe, or maybe they like it. I don't know. But that's number one. Definitely know who you are. I think as a person, as a manager, that's number one. Number two for me is always hire the right people. So, and how do you do that? Like I mentioned before, it's a way that if you understand who you are, you know who are the people you want to be interacting with, and you know what they want them. You know what you want them to bring to the table. So I know that I'm a very relaxed manager. Once you gain my trust, I let you make decisions, really, and I also let you make mistakes, and that's fine. If I trust your judgment, and I know that if I ask you a question, you will be able to give me good enough reasoning for why you choose something over something else. Right. And so I'm aware that, like I mentioned before, I would look more at people's wit and motivation rather than necessarily experience. Other people, they don't want. I consider myself as a manager more as I'm not a manager in the end. My job is to guide people. My job is to get everybody as a manager to run in the company in the same direction. And I think this is a very important perspective that people tend to forget. People, when you manage people and teams, they need to have a meaning for what they're doing. You know, if over time you don't give them meaning, you will lose them. The good ones you will lose. The bad ones will stay. But this is very counterproductive, right? So you have to give them meaning. And there are many different tools and ways to do that. We can maybe talk about that some other time. Sure. But definitely give people meaning, appreciation for what they do. Let them know if what they did actually delivered what we wanted. What was the impact of the work? I think that's super, super, super important. And in many organizations, very, very much ignored. And this is what creates bad culture, and this is what actually kills companies in the end. So I think these are the 2 or 3 things I would definitely look at from a managerial perspective as to, really focus on. And I think the underlying thing under all of this is really called culture. And I think I used to really look down on this term culture for companies, but over the past, 5-7 years, when I'm more managerial now and less hands-on, I realized how important it is to be true to yourself and therefore create a culture that is properly reflected in the company and in the company's values to get the right people who feel comfortable and natural in this environment, and then they can really blossom there and they can be the best that they can.
So I can see in the background there are quite a few books. Which one book do you recommend for this specific job?
Wow, to be honest, I haven't read a book about product management in like 10 years, I think. Really. I think with the way this industry is moving, it's moving so fast. There's so much change. Just look at what happened now with this coronavirus, right? Everything changed. I used to sit in the office with my guys, with everybody, and we would touch shoulders and speak. Now the entire communication changed. So no book can cover that. I think there's so much stuff going out there that's worth reading. I would follow definitely stuff on Medium, for example, from product people. And there's an organization called Mind the Product. And there's an organization called Jam, making jam. So they also do product and they write some nice articles. But I don't think it makes sense to read books about product management because, like I said, in the end, the permutations are so delicate and they're so important that, it's good to have an understanding of frameworks. And that's something you need to learn. You need to read, you need to build. But it's more important to be able to adapt these things to the case that you have in front of you.
Okay. So, Itai, I really appreciate your time. I know you're a very, very busy person, and it's been really great catching up. And I guess we'll talk again soon. So,
my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I'm happy to talk anytime.
Okay. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye.